Hi, this is Paul. Dave Rubin on the Rubin Report recently did a live stream about why did the IDW fall apart. You had God Sad, Peter Boghossian, Michael Shermer. These were sort of people kind of in the second tier of the IDW, if you think about Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Brett Weinstein as sort of the top tier. And I was a little disappointed in the live stream because they never really talked about the topic that much. And actually, a treatment of that would have been helpful because sort of what makes up the IDW are people who were politically on the left, but no longer continued to evolve along the lines of Atheism Plus. This first became apparent to me when I did my conversation with James Lindsay, and you can find that conversation on my channel. Dave Rubin, of course, continues to be highly anti-woke, but much more religion-friendly, whereas the other three continue to maintain their posture as religious skeptics, but no longer really want to tangle with religious people. About the only group that really wants to tangle with religious people in terms of atheism are the new woke atheists, which is very interesting, and it sort of sets up some of the dynamics around the present view of Christianity and its morality. Now, Rationality Rules still wants to talk about Christianity and wrangle with IDW figures like Jordan Peterson. And so he jumped on this conversation between Jordan Peterson and Stephen Fry that was a few months ago, and I thought it was interesting. Now, part of this is this shift of alignment in the West from church as moral vanguard, which it was during the Cold War, to an immoral force, which it became for new atheism between, let's say, 9/11 and 2013, 2015. We might use Oberfeld, the decision by the Supreme Court, as another marker. They would not agree with that because almost all the IDW individuals would be pro-gay marriage. Peterson, he's a little ambiguous on that in some ways. So it's interesting that we've seen sort of another chapter turn in these struggles. So Rationality Rules comes in and he pays attention to the Jordan Peterson, Stephen Fry, and he's going to try and frame the Christian argument against godlessness. He wants to remind people of Immanuel Kant, which I'm really not quite sure why, and get into the hypothetical imperatives and the categorical imperatives. So let's jump into the video and take a look.
There's something that's happening in our culture that's not sitting right with you. Okay, how do you defend the damn culture against it without making the claim that we do have something of, let's say, higher value that is?
Okay, so Peterson begins, this is a little teaser at the beginning of the video, and Peterson begins sort of in the traditional way that the apologists and the atheists have squared off, let's say, between 9/11 and the Supreme Court decision to legalize same-sex marriage. And that argument was that atheists have no moral foundation because a foundation requires a God to make the foundation. So that sort of sets up this entire video and the argument. And you will continue to find that argument played out again and again in sort of the waning days of online Christian atheist debates. Of course, Jordan sort of stands in for Christians here, but of course, as we've noted many times, his relationship with Christianity is ambiguous.
Is the consequence of following a particular tradition.
Yes.
Because without that, you lose the argument instantly.
Indeed. On what possible ground can the moral relativists defend their own culture, given that they reject that their culture is objectively good? How can they possibly condemn the misconduct of other cultures if they don't believe there is a universal categorical conduct to live up to? Does not the disease of nihilism render one morally impotent? This is the central claim we're going to investigate in this video, but first, let's get some context on the table.
Now, what he says there is rather interesting because, of course, that has been the argument, that atheists are sort of left in a swamp of relativism and they have no morality. Now, again, this argument is being fought. There's sort of a time shift that has happened. Maybe I should make a drawing. So maybe this chart will help. I should confess that this is my second time trying to make this video, and I have that sometimes when I just isn't sort of coming easy to me. Most of the stuff I do like this comes really easy, and this one's just been hard. So you have this evolution of moral alignment in broader Western culture from the Cold War to 9/11. And again, these are generalizations, and they sort of blur, and you'll notice that. So in the Cold War to 9/11, the church is an intensification of public morality. It's prudish but aligned. Now, that begins to unravel in the 80s with the rise of what is called the moral majority and the resistance from what is the 1960s counterculture that through the 70s sort of increasingly takes public power. You know, you can really see this in some ways with the presidencies of Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. You know, Jimmy Carter was sort of an old style evangelical. He was born again. There's just so much data and so much detail to these narratives that to summarize them always feels a little I want I want to summarize them, but I also want to streamline them. So basically, 9/11 is a good marking place where new atheism finally sort of takes the stage, comes out on its own, and basically makes moral arguments against the church. The church is immoral, and the Bible is immoral, and the morality of the Bible is outdated and ought to be left behind, and a new morality ought to be embraced. Now, conservative Christians sort of come back and say, show us the foundations of this new morality. And this is kind of what Rationality Rules is talking about in the beginning here. Are there foundations to this new morality? Well, there's certainly not the foundations that you have because your foundations are corrupt. Oh, okay. Well, do they need to have foundations? And this sort of puts modernists and people who want to argue in a rationalist modernist frame a little bit in trouble because the flailing about sort of leads to maybe sort of a natural law basis for morality, but very quickly progressives get in trouble because natural law has been taken a few centuries ago, and so that's just sort of sets up the same dynamic debates. Now Obergefell, which is the United States Supreme Court decision on same-sex marriage, I don't know if that's so much a good marker. Maybe it's Barack Obama's second inaugural. Maybe that's a good one when they sort of flipped on Giglio. And whereas they had Rick Warren as America's pastor to say the prayer at Barack Obama's first inaugural, and then they couldn't have Giglio do it the second inaugural because he hadn't progressed with respect to same-sex marriage. And again, Rod Dreher's blog for me is noteworthy here because it was Dreher who really came out very strongly saying that the Obergefell decision and the same-sex marriage decision is really going to be definitive in terms of American social conversation with respect to morality. And, you know, Dreher often sounds alarmist. I'm going to shake his hand next weekend. He's coming to Sacramento area. But he's proven fairly accurate with a lot of this stuff, which is chilling because he has many more chilling prognostications. So basically what happens in this new transition is that the new atheists are split between, let's say, classic new atheists and atheism plus. And there's a lot about that split that's out there on the internet. And Gamergate is in there. A number of those conflicts are in there. And as I mentioned before, a lot of classical new atheists are no longer that interested in debating Christianity. They're much more interested in combating each other because they have a sense that this is where the cultural moral conversation is happening. It's happening between the woke tribe and sort of the classical progressives, who many of whom are now sort of IDW. And I think that's one of the best ways to understand the IDW, is that these people are dispossessed by the progressives. And so now Jordan Peterson sort of recently unapologetically wears the mantle as a conservative, which is an interesting thing. And maybe among them, he's probably can wear it better, because if you look at Dave Rubin and Peter Boghossian and Gad Saad and Michael Shermer, they're all just sort of homeless. And I made a tweet yesterday when I saw, so a few days ago, Peter Boghossian's resignation letter was put on Barry Weiss's Substack. And so then I just saw this video. And what is Peter Boghossian going to do? He's going to have to sort of, he's back in exile land with Jordan Peterson, Brett Weinstein, not Sam Harris, because Sam Harris wasn't occupying the university, but that's where Peter Boghossian is. And so I made the comment, Peter Boghossian recently resigned from the university. Brett Weinstein was kicked out. Now they make content for social media. Jordan Peterson, post-university world is happening, brought to us by wokeism. It's what's for dinner. It's beef. It's what's for dinner. That's a little inside joke. I've got all these 1980s and 90s commercials running around in my mind, making up my inside jokes that are simply going to be dad jokes that nobody gets. P.S. This has already happened in the church. And what I was referencing there was very much the deplatforming or the change of platforms. Now, this hasn't happened in the church as much, partly because of the fractious nature of Protestantism. And so the same-sex marriage fight, which is going on in my own denomination, is sort of a part of this, even though the IDW are the homeless of America's public intellectuals. Maybe I should write that down, and that'll be the title of this video. Can't really be the title of this video because that's not really what this video is about. And it's these kind of angsty videos that really get long. And of course, I see the messages about verbal diarrhea and why did I make the channel introduction video? What I'm doing in these videos are sort of talking out these ideas and trying to find language and formulation for them, and just trying to get a handle on what is very much right-brained of me right now, but that sort of leaves me always emotionally unsettled because I'm doing this in public. Well, I should get back to the Rationality Rules video because he's going to say some stuff that I'm going to want to respond to. And now, of course, that I use OBS, I don't edit videos after I record them. I am editing them while I'm recording them. Sucks to be you, I guess.
Earlier this year, Jordan Peterson had Stephen Fry on his podcast to discuss a variety of topics in the realm of drama, literature, mythology, and politics, with particular emphasis on atheism, religion, rationalism, empiricism, and morality. It was, by my lights at least, an exceedingly interesting and fruitful conversation between two very intelligent people engaging in a respectful and constructive manner.
Now, he's being pretty solicitous to Jordan Peterson here. And I think that's an evolution on his part, and I think it's a welcome one. He, of course, did this conversation with Jonathan Peugeot. And actually, I think in some ways, Rationality Rules is doing some similar things that I am, but perhaps not either admitting it or aware of it, which is he's making this stuff up as he goes along. And this early fuzzier section, which was really not well formed.
Instantly.
Indeed. On what possible ground can the moral relativists defend their own culture, given that they reject that their culture is objectively good?
Okay. What we're getting at here is a crisis of moral knowledge. I've got some slides to talk about that. So yes, I'm editing this video as I go. It's a crisis of moral knowledge, and he's sort of put its finger on it. That's what Peterson is saying. Peterson, in many ways, is saying is, how can you do a moral evaluation if morality itself is unclear? Well, maybe I have to jump to the moral knowledge slides now. Okay, what are we talking about when we talk about morality? Morality is about mapping, or better, navigating. We're trying to become something good, sort of as an agent. We're trying to go someplace good in an arenic sense. We're caught between dead reckoning, which is sort of like A/B testing. This is lower register, trying to say, well, this is better than that. Satisfaction is better than angst. Fulfillment is better than longing. Rest is better than struggle. Shalom is better than pain. And it's all sort of A/B testing, and it's all sort of dead reckoning. It's sort of like if you're trying to make a trip and you avoid hills. Well, the problem with that sort of dead reckoning is you're going to only be walking in the valley if you're here in California, because the Central Valley of California is a big, huge, giant bowl. And once you hit a hill, if you keep making a turn in order to avoid a hill because it's easier walking, then you just keep walking around in the valley. You never get any place. The weakness of dead reckoning is it's imprecise. And if you want to get to Utah or the Pacific Ocean, you're going to have to figure out a landmark outside of what's in front of you in order to get there. And it's going to involve struggle. Now, less struggle if you're going to go out the Delta, and it might be a little wet. Go out the Delta and reach the Golden Gate of San Francisco. Or, if you get a boat, you can do it. Or if you want to get to Nevada, if you want to get to Las Vegas, let's say, or Reno, you're going to have to go over mountains. Or if you want to get to Oregon, or if you want to get to Mexico or Los Angeles, you're going to have to go over mountains. But you can't just always dead reckon. You can't just always say the road is flatter here, the road is easier here. You need something that's going to incline you to struggle to create an achievement. And now, of course, in Jordan Peterson land, that is meaningful. But it is all dependent upon some sort of fixed measurement and the implicit suspicion of people looking for a moral foundation or a fixed moral map, is that without something that is challenging to us, the dead reckoning isn't going to work very well for us. And so then we look for an absolute, good as such, evil as such. And again, this is all upper register. And so this two worlds mapping is inside and outside. John Vervaeke and I have just put on our calendar another conversation, and I think we're going to talk about some of this stuff, about the sacred and the two worlds mythology and the mapping. So morality is all about this kind of thing. And the difficulty with morality is that you can't get away from it, partly because it's all upper register stuff, and you can't live without it. You just can't do it. And this video of Rationality Rules demonstrates that again and again and again. Now, biblical morality is a little different because of the difference between the revolutionary monotheism and the metadivine realm. And I've talked about this recently in my sermons. And to a certain degree, if reality is fundamentally impersonal, meaning it's not agentic, it is in some ways lacking will, because will is a function of agency. And what that creates in, let's say, ancient polytheism is sort of a brokering. But the tensions were always in these polytheistic metadivine realms, and you can see them with the development of beings like the Fates. And the Fates are sort of adding texture to an arena. And so even the gods in some ways are fated by the fates. And it's sort of like California, elements of California are determined by the geography. The arena itself impinges upon the agents in one way or another. Now, there's an inherent personalism of the biblical God as opposed to the meta-divine realm, and it lends itself to the imago Dei, the image of God, and hence then the countercultural sexual ethic and the opposition to slavery as such. So some of that I talked about in these things come up in my sermons on 1 Thessalonians. Now, the agent arena distinction is a tremendously helpful one, but it has its limitations because, as I said, in some ways, arenas, by virtue of their limitation and their constraints, have agentic qualities, and large enough agents very quickly have arenic qualities. What do I mean by that? When you were growing up in your home, your parents had an arenic quality. They mapped out for you constraints, boundaries, limitations that you, as a budding agent, internalized and learned to live within. Okay? And I think it's part of that reason that the meta-divine realm so often produces characters like the Fates that you find in Greek mythology. So morality is about action and navigation, and it's about better and worse. It's, again, about values. And I think there's a secular moral crisis. This certainly isn't a new discovery of mine. And I'm want to use this word crisis with some care because everything can become a crisis. And maybe this is a way we can get at a lot of what seems urgent and salient and important these days in our little talking, thinking circles. And I don't want to overuse the word crisis because awakening from the meaning crisis and the marriage crisis. Well, what do we mean by crisis? It's a communal problem whose solution involves getting some critical mass of human beings, as we like to say, on the same page. It's basically getting agreement between agents that we will all use our agency in a similar direction to achieve a goal. And that in the past, we have in fact done so and arrived at some achievements, and those achievements may now be threatened. Charles Blow, I just caught a recent editorial of his about basically the falling apart of marriage in America. Now, that's an important thing, partly because of where Charles Blow sits in the New York Times constellation of opinion writers. He's definitely a progressive, and now he's doing some hand-wringing about the loss of marriage, and of course the conservatives want to jump in and say, told you. These crises cause mass suffering. So if you believe in the climate change crisis, then this crisis will cause mass suffering. If China decides to use military action to take Taiwan, that will provoke a number of crises all around the world. Silicon chip crisis, military crisis. These things, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a fear that if the United States and the Soviet Union can't get on the same page, we'll nuke the world. So solutions would make life better, or at least not lose life in many ways. And in secularity, crowdsourcing continues to pass for something like divine authority. With the loss of a public ontological embrace of the upper register as being something beyond mere psychology or even sociology, democracy has to pass, agreement has to pass for something like divine authority, and we bump into this again and again. Now, this is a crisis of moral knowledge. Well, what do I mean by knowledge? Well, I mean what we all understand knowledge to be. Water is wet. The ground is down. The sky is up. a whole cluster of issues that we are struggling to pin down, find common language for, etc. Objective morality, as Adam Friended likes to say, divine revelation, as theists like to work with, natural law, as some theists and some atheists out there think about Carter, Bionic Mosquito, and Carl in the comment section, wokeism, which we've been talking about, and of course the Enlightenment. And in many ways, what this crisis within New Atheism is about is, in fact, the Enlightenment, whereas they both agree that they don't buy the old paradigms of theism or divine revelation. Really, in some ways, I think part of the reason that natural law is coming to the fore again, and why you'll find some of these new atheists seeking comfort and community among Christians, is because of natural law and the kinds of things that deism afforded. Well, back to the video.
How can they possibly condemn the misconduct of other cultures?
Now, what he's doing is sort of, when I finally get to 1 Corinthians at some point, he's subtly making the argument of his opponents.
If they don't is obtained, can the moral relativists defend their own culture, given that they reject that their culture is objectively good? How can they possibly condemn the misconduct of other cultures if they don't believe there is a universal categorical conduct to live up to?
Okay, right there. And he's saying that this is what his opponents are arguing, that there's a that there's a categorical out there that is orienting us and letting us know what's right and wrong. And he says that this is what this video will be about. I don't know if he appreciates just how deep that question goes by virtue of his conduct in this video.
Does not the disease of nihilism render one morally impotent? This is the central claim we're going to investigate in this video, but first, let's get some context on the table. Earlier this year, Jordan Peterson had Stephen Fry on his podcast to discuss a variety of topics in the realm of drama, literature, mythology, and politics.
Now, it's helpful to know that Stephen Fry and Jordan Peterson met each other, possibly for the first time, at the Monk debate, where they were both making arguments about identity politics. And that sort of goes back to the HGM video that wokeism is really a continued outgrowth of identity politics. And so with that, as HGM would say, with that defunct framing, then Jordan Peterson and Stephen Fry were on the same side.
With particular emphasis on atheism, religion, rationalism, empiricism, and morality. It was, by my lights at least, an exceedingly interesting and fruitful conversation between two very intelligent people engaging in a respectful and constructive manner.
Again, he's being, awfully kind to Jordan Peterson. I'm sure he'd love to have a debate with Jordan Peterson like Sam Harris is having, so.
At the time of watching it, I immediately wanted to weigh in on a few things. For instance, Jordan expressed that he's
skeptical, let's say, of the atheist skepticism.
Since the atheist skepticism, or at least the skepticism embodied by the Four Horsemen, is entirely destructive, containing no redemptive element.
Now, he's skeptical of the skepticism, and to understand why Peterson would say that, you have to have an understanding of his project. He is trying to establish, in some ways, a Darwinian moral value structure that isn't like social Darwinism.
And I have to say, I think he's broadly correct in this assessment, which in its own right could do with an expansion. But since I'm not yet sure on how many videos I'll make in relation to this conversation, and to which the answer, I must admit, will depend on how well received this video is, I want today to focus on a divine response by Fry to the charge of moral relativism. So let's begin by attempting to stillman the objection.
So let's say we're going to defend the values of the West to the degree that they're worth defending. then we are making a claim that the inheritors of a particular tradition have something valid morally on their side. Or we.
So Peterson is saying there has to be a moral yardstick, or there's no point in defending it. Now, we know that Peterson is at least aware of C.S. Lewis and has read some of Lewis. This is a move that C.S. Lewis makes again and again and again and again with individuals like H.G. Wells in something like The Abolition of Man.
Cannot defend that position. There's something that's happening in our culture that's not sitting right with you. Okay, how do you defend the damn culture against it without making the claim that we do have something of, let's say, higher value that is the consequence of following a particular tradition?
Okay, and right there, that little end piece is important because of, again, Jordan's bigger project of having a non-social Darwinian value system that is built on Darwinian truth. In other words, if in the public realm, and Peterson continues to show himself as an ardent modernist in this realm, where it is illegitimate to bring into the public claims, basically claims of divine revelation in this matter. This is part of the modernist truce to end the wars of the Protestant Reformation, and that's been around us. And the difficulty was that throughout history, both sides were able to, one way or another, have sufficient agreement on moral yardsticks implicitly that they could lay aside a bunch of the doctrinal and dogmatic issues that they had been warring against, warring over. Okay? So now what comes is that there are new moralities that are coming to the fore, and so those implicit agreements are no longer. And so Jordan wants to attempt basically something that has been attempted and failed all along, attempt to construct a moral value system, but he's going to do it not necessarily on the basis of divine revelation or even, is it natural law? But he's going to try to do it upon a tradition and say that this tradition has worked. All right? And we see that it's worked. Now, this is a dead reckoning sort of working. We've seen that it's worked because the Western countries are the countries that everyone else in the world wants to move to. Our economies are more powerful. Our institutions are more robust. We're basically, over the last few hundred years, have held supremacy over the earth. It's basically a karmic argument. And in that way, it's sort of an Old Testament argument that the will of God or the will of the gods, now we're going to erase those, can be seen in success. And we know and believe by virtue of dead reckoning that our way of life is, in fact, most successful. And let's not, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And that's sort of the argument against the progressives, because the woke progressives will say, oh no, it can be far better than now. And it can be far better if we dismantle the patriarchy, if we dismantle white supremacy, if we dismantle these institutions that are filled with these things, if we take apart these institutions, then we can thrive. Now, what's interesting in this is there is in this some interesting analogies to the history of the middle 20th century if you read someone like Timothy Snyder, Black Earth, because in many ways the Nazis were the naturalists who believed that in dismantling institutions, the right natural state of affairs would emerge. And that, of course, was all their social Darwinism. And it was the Marxist who believed that class struggle, of course, would yield the utopia that they were looking for. The difficulty with Marxism, of course, very early on was the fact that Stalin had to starve the Ukraine was evidence that it was a bad idea. But, he was determined to go forward, and maybe the revolution needed a little help at the expense of dead babies in the Ukraine and Belarus and Poland, and we'll get there. So one of the interesting dynamics in this whole conversation has actually to do with institutions. But Peterson has sort of become here a traditionalist and said the West has succeeded, and his conversations about environmentalism and capitalism, he's basically saying these things aren't broke, don't fix them. Capitalism, democracy, all these institutions will continue to give us the blessings that we require to face the variable crises that we face in the future. So let's keep going, and this wokeism is a bad turn. So that's really Peterson's argument. And now he's saying with respect to morality that without the gods, without the stars, within the iron box of secularity, we can dead reckon it sufficiently looking at the success of the last few centuries to believe that staying the course is the right way to go. And we can use this to sort of assemble a yardstick, a moral yardstick by which we can continue to navigate our way forward. So it's, in that sense, again, dead reckoning. You don't need the stars to navigate by. You don't need magnetism coming from the North Pole. You don't need a global positioning system. We can basically look at the past few centuries and say, these things work. And on the basis of seeing that they have worked, we are going to make assumptions about natural law or the state of things, and therefore we ought to stick to it, and we ought not to imagine that at the heart of these things is white supremacy, patriarchy, the gender binary, all of these things. That's basically what Jordan Peterson has done.
Yes. Because without that, you lose the argument instantly.
So when it comes to morality, I have a tendency to open with Immanuel Kant's Categorical and Hypothetical Imperatives. And the reason for this is because this distinction quickly dispenses with much of the confusion around moral statements.
Does it? I don't think this is going to do for you what you want it to do for you. It's a useful distinction, but, well, let's let him make it, and then we'll keep going.
A hypothetical imperative is something that we ought to do on the condition that we hold a certain goal. For instance, we can say, if you want to increase human happiness, then you ought not murder. But if someone doesn't hold the goal of increasing human happiness, then this ought statement is unfounded. Whereas on the other hand, a categorical imperative is something that we ought to do unconditionally, without reference to any goal or end. For instance, you ought not murder. And the dialectical stance that Peterson is referring to is that since the religious, for instance the Christian, are convinced that they have categorical imperatives, that is, in the form of immutable and eternal commands issued by the Almighty, they are able to object to the actions of non-Christians in a way that the more relativist can't.
See, by what he's just said here, I don't think he has any understanding of Peterson at all. Because Peterson, and he's listened to a lot of Peterson because he's made a lot of videos about him. But I think he gets Peterson completely wrong here. Peterson, you can't just slide Peterson into the place of, let's say, a really observant Jew who looks at maybe Ben Shapiro, let's say, okay? Ben Shapiro or Dennis Prager. That says, oh, here are these categoricals, and these categoricals are set. Now, what's important here is to look at this, the categorical impairment, because this is deeply dependent. Now, of course, we hear categorical imperative, and we think Kant. Well, why? Well, what is Kant trying to do? Well, that's critical to understand. What is Kant trying to do? Kant is trying to establish a new religion, he is trying to do with the manifest image what has been done within the scientific image and have it apply everywhere. That's key. Okay, but if you read a sentence like this, a categorical imperatives is something that we ought to do unconditionally without reference to any goal. Right there, you've sort of invoked a monarchical vision within modernity. Nothing in any of our lives has ever been this way. That sort of rarefied air belongs purely to the upper register and is not like any world that any of us have ever taken part in, outside of our own imaginations. And the problem is these things sort of stay in our own imaginations and can't go anywhere else. So part of the reason I think I felt so much angst with making this video is because I knew that I was going to struggle with getting things in order in any real coherent way. So let's remember Kant's mission to discover a scientific philosophy. Well, let me pull up that video.
You mentioned the definition of morality is kind of problematic in the moral landscape in the book. So can you tell me about this?
Yes. I think what the book does, it conflates two things. On the one hand, really one major intention of Harris is to point out that there are moral truths and that there is something like a universal morality.
So here's one of the issues. If you're going to make value statements, this is better, this is worse, and just go ahead and try and make a video without making value statements, nobody's going to want to watch it, because what we're interested in is value statements. What we're interested in is meaning. What we're interested in is improvement, or at least not losing achievement. So part of what Sam Harris is doing in this interregnum between, let's say, 9/11 and Obama's second term, let's put it there instead of Oberfeld. Obama's second term is make the argument that we don't need God to make value judgments. That's the heart of Sam Harris's decision. Now, in that way, Peterson agrees. Peterson wants to say we don't need God to make moral judgments. We can dead reckon with tradition and get close enough. And Sam Harris, of course, because of his previous posture, wants to get rid of tradition.
That is absolutely true. On the other hand, he also points out, this is equally a major thing for him, he wants to point out that there are objective, or rather I should say scientific, or he should say scientific to be more precise, truth about human well-being, right? And for him, the two things are the same.
Okay. Scientific, he wanted to move away from objective and embrace scientific claims about human well-being. So, well, what kinds of things would those be? Now, let's say we're in the realm of physical sciences. Let's say a doctor can use instruments and gauge my cardiovascular health at the age of 21, when I was 21, and measure it with some metric. And I'm sure one of you smart doctors will have Dr. Jim, the cardiologist from Idaho. I'm sure he could tell me one way that he could do that. He'll look at my blood pressure, look at my heart rate, figure that out. And now compare it to my cardiovascular health at 58. And he would undoubtedly say, you are not in the same shape you were at 21. Now, maybe it's possible if I worked out very hard and worked very hard on this that I could, but the truth is that, let's say, scientifically, my body at 58 is not what it was at 21. Okay. But now we have the question of by what standard? And it's like asking the question, please tell me the ideal human being. By what standard? And you say, well, you can sort of make a scientific argument, but that's something very specific to, let's say, my cardiovascular health, something that can be measured to one degree by blood pressure or pulse or something like that. Now let's talk about my life. Let's talk about well-being. Is my well-being at 58 better or worse than my well-being at 21? Scientifically. Well, the whole project of science is elimination of variables to achieve a degree of knowledge. And comparing my life between 21 and my life between 58, good luck finding a well-being quotient. Now, maybe you'll look at my physiology. Maybe you'll look at my net worth. Maybe you'll look at the number of children that I've had and family. I was unmarried at 21. I was still part of my nuclear family, going to college. Maybe you'll look at my sex life. Did I have more sex at 21 or 58? I'll answer that for you. 58. How about enjoyment driving cars? Oh, the car I drive at 58. I didn't even have a car when I was 21. How about just fun? And then you get all this social science stuff of maybe having me rate things. And, now remember, Jordan Peterson's a social scientist. Sam Harris is not. So very quickly, this well-being breaks down scientifically, and the kinds of things that you might be able to measure scientifically, if you're really stringent about that word, the problems arise.
Right? On the one hand, objective moral truth, universal morality. On the other hand, scientific facts about what increases well-being and what doesn't. Now, I think the two things, for him, the two things are the same. And I think the two things are very different from one another. And I think that's the major problem of the book, that he conflicts.
And so in some ways, you are still bumping up against the scientific image versus the manifest image. Because for me to rank my well-being between 58 and 21 in terms of the manifest image, you could sit down and go through a whole bunch of categories and say, better at 58, better at 21, better at 58, better at 21. The truth is, I have memories of when I was 21. My memories of what's going on over this last year are much more vivid than my memories of 21. Maybe if I was 21, you were asking me to rank things, but how faithful of a ranker am I? I mean, the whole point of the scientific revolution is to get beyond this agentic, subjective reckoning of things like well-being, and have something which is objective, universal, applies everywhere, categorical. And part of the problem between this is the problem of language. Because categorical and objective and universal are related, but they're certainly not identical.
Or tries to combine these two things. Now, what is different between the two? I think in order to understand this, we can go back to a short philosophical essay written later on. It was actually a little presentation by Ludwig Wittgenstein, the famous philosopher. It's nearly 100 years old, and then it was published much later. Anyways, Wittgenstein's lecture on ethics. And in this lecture on ethics, Wittgenstein says very clearly, there are two different ways in which we use the terms good or right. Either we use them in a relative sense or in a trivial sense. For instance, this is the right way to go to London, or whatever, to give you other examples.
Now, what he said there is a little deceiving. Relative sense or a trivial sense. And I think he means relative and trivial. That's one of the senses. The other is going to be the absolute sense.
Whatever, this is a good meal, or this is a good swimmer, or this is a good tennis player. This is an example that he uses. And that is always in a relative and a trivial sense. These are all examples for the usage of good or right in a relative or trivial sense, because it's good or right relative to a certain perspective, to a certain activity, and so forth. It's a concretely specified use of good. For instance, the right way to a place might be one that is faster than another way, or it might be one that is safer than another way, or it might be more scenic than another way, right? This is what he means with relative, that it is relative to a specific criterion. Now, and that is different from the usage of good or right in what Wittgenstein calls in an absolute sense, that something is absolutely good, right? For instance, he gives this example about the tennis player. Someone can say, you're not a good tennis player. And then you can say, yeah, I don't care, I just play for fun. I don't really want to become a really good tennis player. But that's very different if someone, what's very different is if someone uses the term good in an absolute way and says, you're not a good person. Yeah. Right? Then this is something where you can't really say, I don't really want to be a good person, right? The usage of the word is on an entirely different level. It's on this absolute level, and so not relative to anything specific. And Wittgenstein then says, in this we use this term, we speak of good or right in an absolute way, and actually that doesn't really make sense because it's not tied to any kind of specific criterion for, and therefore it's something that has a great appeal to us, but it's something that is beyond description and language, and actually also beyond understanding to a certain extent.
Okay, so now we get into, in many ways, sort of some of the issues of modernity and some of the fights between Christians and non-Christians, because Christians will want to say things like, and this is sort of how Rationality Rules views them, okay, we have access to categoricals. And I think in some ways, when Christians say that, they mean something different than Rationality Rules listening to them and saying, oh, you have access to categoricals? Because in a sense, what Wittgenstein is saying here is we don't have access to categoricals. Now, what do we mean by categoricals? Well, go back to this categorical imperative as Rationality Rules talks about it. Something that we ought to do unconditionally without reference to any good. Now, I would argue that even if we have access to a categorical, we wouldn't know how to apply it properly. Now think about that. Because there's the categorical itself, and then there's my interaction with the categorical. And there's a divide there that remains. Whether or not you say you have access to the categorical. Do you have categorical access to the categorical? Do you have perfect access to the categorical? How on earth can you appropriate that and live with that in your life? And in that sense, Wittgenstein has a point. Now, again, it's important here to remember what the project is that Kant is undertaking. Let's see if I can find it quickly.
For your continued support of this channel, and today we're talking again about Kant's ethics, because Kant's philosophy really consists of those two parts. The one, the analysis of pure reason, where he basically just gives an account of reason investigating itself, and then second part of his philosophy is a critique of practical reason, where he explains what can reason tell us practically, how to lead our life. He tries to answer the question, what are we supposed to do? Like the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason equally addresses this so-called scandal of philosophy, namely the fact that philosophy didn't transform itself into a reliable form of science. So Kant also here very intentionally tries...
Now that's critical right there. Because in many ways, what rationality rules would like to say is, well, this is a pure science. And what Sam Harris wants to say is, this is a pure science. And what Immanuel Kant says is, philosophy didn't transform itself into a pure science, so I'm going to do it. Well, did he succeed?
...is to develop a moral philosophy that basically serves as a moral science, as a moral metaphysics. This is what he calls it. Interestingly, he says at the end of the Critique of Practical Reason, this is a very famous quote, that two things fill his mind with admiration and awe: the starry heavens above and the moral law within. And what this quote clearly shows is that the supposed moral law within is very much comparable, or is an analogy to the natural laws that govern the motions of the stars in the sky.
Now, when he says natural laws here in this video, he really means physical laws, okay? The physical laws that govern the stars in the sky. And again, it's critical if you look at my conversation with Arul and Albert Berg's nice little video that he made about what happens with Galileo. Kant is looking back and saying, gosh, I wish philosophy could get its act together and be able to wield this world the way we're doing so far with our knowledge of the physical world and our technology that is following. And of course, this tradition will come. And so what we need to do is put ourselves on a firm foundation. And in order to do that, we're going to have to get, in some ways, beyond empirical observation to something which is categorical and pure and essential.
So again, this underscores this attempt to do ethics in the form of a moral science. Just as a natural science, where we have to identify certain basic laws, for instance in physics, also in Kant's moral metaphysics, his primary aim is to identify the highest moral law, the highest principle. And that for him is the categorical imperative. So the categorical imperative is an unconditional commandment. It's the highest law that is based on no other laws but grounds all the other laws.
So you can see here, so this is what Kant is trying to do. And it's terrifically modern in that it's ripped up from any human life we have down here below, any life that you've ever lived. And it's in that sense, it's purely theoretical, or might we say imaginary. It's all in the upper register and it's just all up here. So here's categorical imperatives.
There are two famous formulations of this categorical imperative. Both are related to one another. The first one is act in such a way that the principles informing your actions are universalizable. So the principles that...
And that universalizable, or universal again, means not subject to context. We want language, now again, he said Wittgenstein was doubtful of this, something that is so purely up there that it can't touch the earth, but yet we want to be able to use this to guide our actions in the earth. It's completely universal. It will be as true in 2021 as in the 17th century. It'll be as true in the United States right now as it is in Africa or China or Europe. It'll be true whether I am a man or a woman, or whether is it conditioned on someone being a human agent? Because these kinds of questions are going to get important when we start talking about, well, the agency of the character of God in the Hebrew and Christian stories.
That inform your actions are supposed to be principles that everyone can apply at any time. A second kind of variation of this is act in such a way that you never treat people merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end.
Now, obviously, I'd already done a commentary on this video, and what HGM and what philosophers later and Wittgenstein will all sort of come down to is, these are lovely ideas, but The absolute cannot touch the particular. Now, of course, in Christianity, that's precisely the claim of the incarnation. But these are the challenges that we're facing in this, okay? Now, what's interesting here is that Rationality Rules comes around and basically says, oh, you Christians claim you have categorical imperatives, and I claim that you don't. Okay. Do Christians claim they have categorical imperatives? Or do Christians claim that God spoke to Israel and God continues to speak to us through Israel and through his word? Are those categorical? Well, that gets complicated really fast. And of course, in the modernist fundamentalist fight, fundamentalists sort of doubled down on this language. And what was obvious in the modernist fundamentalist fight is that both sides were modernist. It's just that fundamentalists decided they were going to use modernity's framing and reframe their scriptures in that framing. Certain older traditions of Christianity never necessarily went down that road, although some toyed with it more than others. Now, again, I don't think Rationality Rules understands Jordan Peterson, because Jordan Peterson is by no means trying to defend categorical imperatives. Jordan Peterson is trying to make an argument that we don't need them, or at least we don't have them, and as a pragmatist, we will probably do better without them if we continue to use history as our guide in this sort of dead reckoning sense of looking around and saying, well, this has worked pretty well for the last few hundred years. Maybe we should try to keep working it. This against those who say, no, the last few hundred years have been filled with white supremacy and patriarchy and gender normativity. And if we get beyond those things, then things will be great. And again, if you don't understand Jordan Peterson's posture, read his first 12 rules for life. Put your house in perfect order, which is probably one of his most poorly worded aphorisms or laws. And before you tell the world what to do. And of course, that sort of came back to haunt him when he had to get over his benzos. So that is what Jordan Peterson keeps trying to say. And I don't think he's understood. And then Stephen Fry is going to make an argument here.
That you lose the argument instantly.
Mm.
So again, Peterson is basically saying we might not have a categorical yardstick, but we have a pragmatic evolutionary yardstick that is better than nothing, and you need some yardstick to make any moral claims at all, and we sort of have one, so let's keep using the one we've got.
I mean, I think a lot of it is to do with the necessity that we all have of redefining it. We have to remember that morality is a question of manners. It is literally what morality means.
Now, I did a commentary on this video a long time ago, and now because I was working on this video, I've had to listen to what he's about to say a number of times. This is an astoundingly bad argument he is about to make. It's an unbelievably bad argument he's about to make. Well, let's let him make it.
That our parents and grandparents had a very, very different and very firm sense of what was immoral.
Okay, what was immoral? Okay. Can you be more specific? Because, again, in modernistic frames, we've always got sort of this updraft that we're making theories and we're abstracting. And so, can you be more specific? And he's going to be.
The word immoral was used in a newspaper or by a person. That person's immoral. It would have a sexual meaning. It would mean that they...
Is that the only sense of morality that your grandparents had? I hardly think so. But that is exactly the argument he's going to make, that we can judge all of moral relativity or durability based on what his grandparents thought about sex. That is his argument. That is an unbelievably bad argument, as I will proceed to show you after I let him make it.
they lived with someone with whom they weren't married, or they lived with someone of the same sex, or that in some way they were philanderers or loose in their morals, meant entirely to do with the bedroom. These were the...
Entirely? If they were a shoplifter, if they were a perjurer, if they were an embezzler, if they were a murderer, even today, if they stepped out on their spouse. Today, that one's still durable for many people. Thou shalt not commit adultery is part of the 10 Commandments. And I still regularly find spouses who try to hold their spouses to that one.
The unforgivable behaviors of a generation that close to us. We can still hug them if we're allowed to in the garden in COVID times. That's how quickly morality changes. So the idea of the culture...
That's how quickly morality... The whole thing. You are not in any way in continuity with your parents in terms of your ideas of right and wrong. Now he's about to say that the word culture is also an unusable word.
Is a false one. There is no the culture.
So Fry's approach here is unconventional in that rather than
Yeah, and he should have stuck more to convention because it probably would have gone better.
Explaining how a moral relativist can critique themselves and others, he simply denies the crucial and implicit premise that the religious possess categorical imperatives.
Is that what he said? He basically said that you are not in any way conversant about morality with your parents. That's what he said. And we can't talk about the culture because that term is meaningless too. He didn't say what Rationality Rules just said he said. I understand why he's hearing that implication in it, but that's not what he said.
That is, even if it were the case that, say, Yahweh issues objective moral commands, it doesn't follow that we have eternal and absolute morality.
Again, this isn't anything of what has been said.
It could be that 1, God updates his laws from time to time, or 2, that we don't actually know what God's laws are, and as a consequence, our conception of these objective laws are relative to our epistemic state, our knowledge of the world. These positions are, as we'll expand upon later, the only really viable theistic explanations as to why the holy books explicitly endorse acts that we now consider reprehensible.
It's like, whoa, we've just, with lightning speed, moved on from what I thought Stephen Fry said was very clear about what he said. And now suddenly we're in a whole different realm. Well, let's pause a moment and look at what Fry said. I think we have to help Rationality Rules out a little bit here because Christians claim that atheists have no morality because they don't have absolute truth. Now let's change the language to categoricals. Now, again, as I said, I don't think Rationality Rules at all understands Jordan Peterson's argument because this whole project is basically about trying within a Darwinian frame, within a modernist frame, to basically make a traditionalist argument that says we can't know categoricals, we can't possess them, so let's look at tradition and let's basically look at history and say these things have tended to outperform other things, so let's keep working with them. And that's their defense against the woke. Now, again, when you look at Peter Boghossian, Gad Saad, Michael Shermer, I think what we see with all of these individuals is that, in a much more Tom Holland way, all of this stuff has been built into them in terms of their moral presuppositions, and they're all sort of already working off of a Christian moral framework. Now, again, I just basically made the comment about Fry's strange defense. In some ways, yes, morality is social. Morals are manners in a way. They determine social status, which is not insignificant. And that question about morality and social status, I think, is a critical one and a helpful one if, in fact, you you don't believe in anything like divine revelation, that, well, basically morals are ways, and this is much more of a Jonathan Haidt argument, morals are ways that we don't need the Chinese to talk about moral scorekeeping. We all do it. That's why we gossip. That's why we do it with each other. And we decide who can be trusted, who can't. And we do that unconsciously. We do that implicitly. And we do it every day. And that's why we have reputation and why we pay attention to reputation. Now, because sexual morality has changed, therefore all moral changes, therefore all morals have changed, and it's categorical. It's just a dumb argument. Sexual standards have changed in the West recently, and then Rationality Rules is going to go on in the video to show how sexual standards have changed. Therefore, Christians don't have categoricals. Therefore, they update. Now, this gets very funny because sometimes I'll hear celebrity atheists say, the problem with Christianity and these categoricals is that they can't be updated. No, churches are updating them all the time. The problem is that they're always updating them. Well, you're kind of blaming us for either. So, is sexual morality a stand-in for morality as such? Is it a stand-in for categoricals? Now, I'm even more disturbed by this argument because of the kinds of stuff Stephen Fry writes. Let's read Galatians 5. So I say to you, walk by the Spirit. So a modernist would say, we'll take that one out right away. We'll use our Jeffersonian editing knife. And you'll not gratify the desires of the flesh. Now, we're talking upper and lower register. Spirit is what moves flesh. So, for the flesh desires what is contrary to the spirit, and the spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Again, all this spirit-flesh stuff people are just going to throw out. Okay, let them throw it out, but let's look at what Paul is going to talk about. The acts of the flesh are obvious. Sexual immorality, sex is in there. Impurity and debauchery, well, there's sort of sexual categories too. Idolatry and witchcraft, well, new atheists would be against idolatry and witchcraft. Bowing to idols, working spells, Sam Harris is not down for those. Hatred, no, we're all against hate. Discord, we'd rather have productive conversations and not just hating each other fruitlessly. Jealousy, that's not a good one. Fits of rage, we don't want to see that. Selfish ambition, we don't like that in each other. Dissension, no, we want people to be loyal. Factions, we want people to hang together. Envy, we say that's bad. Even ContraPoint says that's bad. Drunkenness, well, we might joke about it, but if you're drunk all the time, we're going to want you to get into a 12-step program. Orgies, well, even though we're sexually liberated, those not often a good idea. Not often a good idea. But I'll give you that one too if you want it. And the like. And in fact, here, Paul of Tarsus believes that, this list of virtues is pretty much agreed to, for the most part, by a whole lot of people, whether they're Jews or Gentiles. And in fact, 2,000 years later, it looks pretty durable. Well, let's read the good side. I warn you, as I did before, that those who live like this will not inherit the kingdom of God. Okay, we'll throw that out because you don't believe any of that stuff. Okay, get it. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, forbearance, that's long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. I would dare bet Rationality Rules would say, I can agree with that list. And then the Apostle Paul says, against such things there is no law. And that is proven to be an amazingly durable statement that in China, where they're keeping track of people, love, joy, peace, patience, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, that will help your social credit score in China. It'll help your social credit score implicitly in the UK, in America, in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, almost all over the world. Again, I've mentioned a few times I've been watching a lot of Survivor lately. It's a fascinating show with respect to these questions of morality and goodness. Against such things there is no law. Those who belong to Christ have crucified the flesh and its passions and desires. Since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit. Let us not be conceited, provoking, and envying each other. In other words, whether or not you buy anything that Paul has to say about the Spirit or the flesh, these two lists are pretty darn durable, at a far greater range than what Stephen Fry imagines. And this is Stephen Fry making this argument. Let's take a look at, let's just Google core Roman virtues. And, okay, fides, acting in good faith. We hear that one all the time. Reliability, gratefulness, loyalty, selflessness, generosity, simplicity, being incorruptible, charitable, justice, orderliness, fairness, responsibility, empathy, to be resolute, endurance, perseverance, courage, respectful, industrious, dedicated, sense of moral health, dignity, fairness, self-discipline, self-control, modesty, merciful, all of this stuff. And, C.S. Lewis, if you read The Abolition of Man and you look at the Tao, he goes into it. If you read Jonathan Haidt's The Happiness Hypothesis, he goes into it. This stuff is remarkably durable. And Stephen Fry, who is writing books about classics, you can't see this? You made that argument? Wow. That's a bad argument. Now, I already played this video, so there's confusion between the two. Now, what we tend to look at are these virtues as absolutes as such. They are categorical as such, but their application depends contextually. And I think we all know this. Now, how do we know these things? Now, C.S. Lewis talks about moral intuitions, and C.S. Lewis would grant, as do I, Stephen Fry, rationality rules, and a good many of all these other characters, whatever side we're on, that they have moral intuitions. C.S. Lewis would say these are simply basic to humanity. And part of the amazing thing about these moral intuitions and these lists of morality is that if in fact they're coming from below, we're picking moralities that condemn us. We pick moral absolutes, as it were, that in fact we regularly fail, and we know it. And this gets into Jordan Peterson's talk about conscience. Now, downstream of Judaism, you have the combination of the numinous and moral intuitions. And I think this is actually a lot of what Stephen Woodford, Rationality Rules. I think this is actually a lot of what he is complaining about, because he is, as a modernist, completely dismissive of the numinous, categorically, and wants to continue to act as if he has moral intuitions, even though I'm not sure he has any idea where these intuitions come from. He certainly is acting on behalf of them, because as you watch his video, he will say, well, slavery's bad and same-sex marriage is good. And these are based on his moral intuitions. Now, moral intuitions are only going to get you so far, because your moral intuitions are, of course, informed by your experience around you. That's a second sort of dead reckoning. In other words, what Jordan Peterson sort of does with his historical analysis about traditions, and he tries to go back as far as he can by using things like mythology, using fairy tales, using religious texts. I mean, it's fairly similar to what Jonathan Haidt does with the happiness hypothesis, is saying, well, these are pretty good, and so we're going to employ them and see how they work out now. And we ought to put a degree of faith in them, because they've proven to work in the past. They should prove to work in the future. And that's, I think, a better argument than Grandma thought differently about sex than we do. Well, a lot of things have happened with respect to sex. Now, the difficulty is figuring out on what grounds to evaluate them. And because Peterson is looking at it via tradition, and he's asking some pretty serious questions about, well, do we really know how the pill is going to change society? No, we don't. Do we really think that the sexual liberation from the sexual revolution has been a good thing? Well, feels good in the moment, but long term hasn't proven to be very good for children or the family. Now, assessing some of this stuff, I want to talk a little bit about bounded set and centered set. And every time I bring this up, I have to remind myself that this is a conversation that has happened mostly within the church, mostly with respect to what we call missiology. Because, in a sense, what Rationality Rules wants to say is, Christians assert, and some of them do, and I know that no true Scotsman, yada, 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 that, well, here the Bible gives us things to obey. And the Bible does. There are plenty of rules in the Bible. There are plenty of laws in the Bible. But the application of those laws, you will find, well, varies even with respect to God. Let's take a look at the question of David's adultery with Bathsheba. Many of you know the story. Bathsheba is on her roof bathing, and that's a critical key part of the story, because what that means in that context is she likely had just finished her period. And so she was taking a purity bath as such. And David, who is no longer going to war with his armies, but staying in the palace, kind of bored, spies with his little eye in that little city of David, Bathsheba, naked on the roof having a bath. David's like, I like what I see. Sends his servants over. Bathsheba really doesn't have a lot of choice in the matter. A lot of people have tried to ask questions about her culpability in this affair. She comes over. They have an affair. She gets pregnant. Uriah, David's servant, who fights in his army, he's a Hittite. He's not even a Jew. David has his little army of really outsiders who are his core. David calls him back and says, I want a report from the front. And Uriah gives him a report. He says, well done, good soldier. Go home and sleep with your wife. Let's cover this thing up. And Uriah doesn't go and sleep with his wife. He sleeps outside at the door, and he says, I would never go and enjoy my wife and my bed while my fellow soldiers are risking their lives in service of you, O king, at the front. I'm a faithful servant. Darn it. So then, Uriah, come back tomorrow and we'll celebrate a little bit before you have to go back to the front. So David gets him drunk, thinking, he's never going to have enough moral fortitude to not sleep with his hot wife when he's drunk. But oh no, the moral fortitude of Uriah the Hittite is far greater than that of David. And Uriah still doesn't sleep with his wife. So then David tells his general, when you're taking the city and the fighting gets fierce, make sure Uriah is up front and then fall back from him so the enemy will kill him. And then I will be there to console his grieving wife and take her into the harem. This is a really bad thing on many levels. And I would think Stephen Fry and his mother and his grandmother, all the way back to Iron Age Israel, with that morality which we see the new atheists decry all the time, will all stand together and say, David is wrong. So, of course, God sends Nathan. And Nathan tells a little story about someone who had a huge flock and his neighbor who had one little lamb that was loved and cared for by the family as if a child. And then when a guest came to the wealthy man with a huge flock, he didn't want to sacrifice even one of his own sheep, but instead takes the lamb from the neighbor and kills it for the guest. And David stands up and says, that man should die. And Nathan says, you are that man. Can't you feel it? The indignation, the righteousness, the moral intuitions. What does David deserve? Death. David knows it. Nathan knows it. You know it. I know it. Stephen Fry knows it. Stephen Woodford knows it. Rationality Rules knows it. All of us know it. God doesn't kill David. Who dies? The child, David's son. Is that justice? The Bible, we've been discussing this for over 2,000 years, 3,000 years probably, if David was around 1000 BC. Are biblical commands deontological? What do I mean by that? Well, watch HGM's video about Kant's ethics. Here's a rule. He who kills shall be killed. It's there in the Old Testament law. If God gave the law, why would God be so forgetful or have so much favoritism with respect to David to not kill David for his horrendous sin, not take his life? God is clearly able, within the context of Old Testament narrative, to take the life of someone who violates his law. Onan spilled his seed on the ground. It did it for him. What about David? Why does the son carry the blame? Well, this is the way the Bible talks. Now, is morality relative? Can we say, to the degree that we can grasp upon a categorical, killing someone is wrong? Yeah. In an upper register way? Are there times when it is justifiable or necessary for someone to die? Yeah. Does God know this, the God of the Old Testament, the character that we find in the Bible? Clearly. This is sort of the difference between bounded set and center set. Just because there's some flexibility to the elements of morality doesn't mean that there's no narrative, that there's no moral gravity in place. And I think these things are things that we intuit. Now, you can find a write-up about, so Paul Hebert was the missiologist who sort of worked up this bounded set versus centered set, because he's working on the question of morality and Christianity with respect to people of other cultures who are becoming Christians. Should these laws that we feel in the upper register are in fact absolute? Should they, and to what degree should they, be applied to other cultures and nations? And I think his insight is really helpful. It's sort of moving towards and moving away from aspects of morality. In other words, if we think about it more like gravity, more like forces, in a much more dynamic way, you can have an understanding how, well, things can be stretched, variations can come, but there's still a moral gravity underneath that is moving things in a certain direction. Did David do wrong? Yes. Was it worthy of his death? Yes. Why did God not take his life? Why did God take the life of the son? Now, what this creates is a moral universe. And this is why narrative is so important, and why narrative is so much more powerful than these little deontological rules. Now, that doesn't mean that bounded set theories are unimportant. Bounded set theories are really good. I'm really mad at my neighbor. I want to kill him. Should you? No. Is that an absolute? Yeah. Are there circumstances in which your neighbor's death might be required by God or by a community? Yes, that's possible. Is it within your hand to take? No. Look at David and killing Saul. Saul wants to kill David. Everyone around David is saying, you're justified in killing Saul because he wants to kill you. And David keeps saying, I will not raise my hand against the Lord's anointed. These are the kinds of moral conversations we have. It doesn't mean that there is no morality. It doesn't mean that categorality is inaccessible to us. Within the upper register, we can't help but feel that way. What it does mean is that, well, if there isn't any absolute moral judge who can finally say what is right and what's wrong, then we're kind of stuck in dead reckoning land. We see this in Paul's sexual ethic. How? Well, if you read 1 Corinthians 4, And you have this kind of crazy statement about possessing your own vessel. Well, we can compare it against the Romans. The Romans had sexual ethics, but it wasn't that they didn't have any sexual ethics. Almost every society has some sort of sexual ethic, and it's usually tied to other moral elements within the systems. So this is the word that Nancy on the Freddie and Paul show got all twisted about. For the Romans, the penis is for pleasure, procreation, and power. Read Tom Holland's Dynasty. It was expected that Roman men would use it to those ends on men, women, boys, and girls. That was their sexual ethic. How do we know that? Holland gives this delightful little analysis that Emperor Claudius, who was emperor at the time of the letter of this, I just took this slide from my sermon, of 1 Thessalonians 4, had a suspicious sexual ethic of only sleeping with women. People thought that odd, because for Romans, especially a high-status Roman man, the penis is for pleasure, procreation, and power. And I would still argue that, in many ways, as many feminists argue, men use the penis for power. He had a physical and speech deformity, which meant that people thought him abnormal anyway. Why not abnormal sex life for a high-status Roman man? That's a very different sexual ethic than we have. Does that mean that there are no boundaries? Well, where should we find our boundaries? Jordan Peterson says, well, we're going to sort of look at tradition, and we're going to look at biology, and we're going to look at evolutionary biology, and we're going to sort of put that together. A Christian would say, well, actually, I'm going to use the Bible. But I'm not going to use the Bible just simply as, bang, here it is. Well, why would I say that? Well, some fundamentalists kind of sound that way. But here's a problem, and I've made this point before. If you carefully read the laws in Exodus, and if you carefully read comparable laws in Deuteronomy, you find differences. Well, why? Well, those are the kinds of conversations that biblical scholars have. But what does it show? It shows that you don't just need all these tiny little fixed bounded set points to actually have a living, viable, moral economy. It's not categorical everything as found in your book or nothing at all, because no one actually lives that way. As I said before, Stephen Fry as a moral universe that is conversant with his parents and his grandparents and the ancient Romans, and of all people, Stephen Fry should know it. And not say such silly things. Maybe he's backed into a corner because Jordan is leaning on him. And so this is your argument? You're going to use this particular sexual morality as a stand-in for everything? And I think, again, part of the reason I use, Paul's general ethic. Love one another. Where would Paul get that ethic? Jesus. Now, I can't expect Rationality Rules to know much about the Bible because he's sort of picking up listening to Christians and how they talk. And, sometimes Christians make bad arguments. And sometimes Christians give an idea in order to make an argument. Well, we're going to use these, watch the debate around same-sex marriage. I don't think the bulwark around same-sex marriage is these 7 so-called clobber passages in the Bible. And if you're curious about what I think about same-sex marriage, I've got 5 hours of video to listen to. And most of you don't care to listen to that. Well, actually, a bunch of you have already listened to it. So the Bible would be a much shorter book if it just played in categorical imperatives. And it doesn't. It's full of narrative, and that narrative informs a supple, living, breathing, moral universe that is applicable to people today. But it's not without maintenance, which is why we train pastors and teachers, and why we have conversations, and why we have debates like the church is having debate now over same-sex marriage. Look at Socrates. Why are there dialogues? A lot of them have to do with morality. Others are more categorical. Others, or are you confusing categoricals for wisdom literature in something like the book of Proverbs, full of categoricals? And what's weird about this is the inconsistencies again. Morality is obviously relative. What do you mean by relative? It's self-evident that slavery is bad and gay marriage is good. Did you forget your first point? That's what I see happening again and again. Therefore, anyone who believes in divine revelation should be marginalized. I thought marginalization was bad. Let's not get too deontological with respect to marginalizing people who we think are doing the world harm. Isn't that almost always the basis for marginalizing anyone? Moral imagination is by nature categorical and feels self-evident. That's the upper register. Thinking categorically as individuals and aspiring to do so as groups seems properly basic to humanity. When we say X is wrong and Y is right, we can't help but imagine it in a categorical way. In other words, let's back off a little bit of modernity and say psychologically, these are the tools we have and these are the tools we use. And we use these tools together, and it's actually been very, very successful for human beings. Because once we can sort of have categoricals among us, we can actually have a society. You don't have a society without categoricals. We run into trouble when we meet another person who doesn't see it our way, and then we have a crisis. So, well, I should maybe get into... Oh, let's see if I can pull this in. Yeah, I can. Nope. Okay, I didn't make slides for these, but I'll just use some notes that I made in OneNote for them. Let's look at slavery. Now, slavery is simply assumed part of the ancient world. What kind of command would you like to see? You shall have no slaves. We'd like to see that too. What kinds of commands wouldn't we like to see? You shall have no internal combustion engines. How about that command? You shall not own more than $5,000 worth of property. How about that command? Would such categoricals be of much worth in today's world? Well, maybe. Not a lot of people seem to like to follow them. So you've got slavery. A big piece of modern abolition is, in fact, in the Industrial Revolution. I don't know, maybe I should just do a different video on slavery and gay marriage with respect to these arguments, because these two arguments keep coming up. And I would argue that the moral gravity beneath both of them is what's energizing the conversation. There are lots of elements to the question of what happened with slavery. There are lots of moving pieces with respect to gay marriage. And again, I know for some of you, I see more moving pieces than you'd like me to see, because you'd like me to simply be more deontological with respect to gay marriage. I am who I am. And we have these moral conversations all the time. The church has had these moral conversations with respect to slavery, with respect to usury, with respect to divorce. This is how we conduct business. Now, when Jesus says God hates divorce, that's pretty deontological. And then he also says, well, God permitted divorce because of the hardness of your hearts. Did God permit slavery because of our lack of machines? And do we congratulate ourselves now being post-slavery as wimps because now we have machines and all sorts of other things that, and other economic systems that allow us to avoid slavery? These are incredibly complex arguments, and they're worthwhile. Just because they're complex doesn't mean they're unclear, but they're worth going through. And I really just don't have the time or the energy to do them right now, but I wanted to make these points at least initially. Maybe this will be the second video I throw away with respect to rationality rules video, but maybe not. Maybe I'll post it. Anyway, leave a comment. Let me know what you think.